There is a question that lingers in the hearts of many. Why does God seem distant? Why does He, the Creator of all, dwell in the depths of eternity unseen and untouched by human hands? Why, if He loves us, does He remain alone? To understand this, we must first recognize that God is utterly complete within Himself. Unlike us, who seek companionship to fill the void of our existence, He is fullness itself. He does not lack, He does not yearn, He does not need. His solitude is not loneliness, but rather the expression of divine sufficiency. From the dawn of human thought, people have wrestled with the nature of God, His power, His will, and most perplexingly, His solitude. The question arises, if God is love, if He is the source of all relationships, why does He seem to dwell alone, beyond the reach of human touch? This is not the solitude of loneliness, nor the silence of absence, but a profound mystery, one that invites us to step beyond human assumptions and into the depth of divine reality. God's solitude is not like ours. When we speak of being alone, we often mean isolation, a separation that brings longing or sorrow. Our need for companionship is woven into the very fabric of our being. We seek others because we are incomplete in ourselves. But God's solitude is of an entirely different nature. He is not alone because He lacks anything. He is alone because He is everything. Before the universe came into existence, before time itself was spoken into being, God was. In that eternal moment, before the first breath of creation, He was already whole, already full, already complete. This is a truth difficult for finite minds to grasp. We live in a world where everything depends on something else. The tree needs sunlight, the river needs a source, and we, as people, need one another. But God depends on nothing. He is not a being among other beings, nor a force within a greater system. He is existence itself. His solitude, then, is not an emptiness, but a fullness beyond measure. If He needed something outside of Himself to be complete, He would not be God. Even in His divine solitude, He chooses to create. Not out of necessity, not out of lack, but out of sheer abundance. His creation is not a remedy for loneliness, but an outpouring of His perfection. He does not make the world to fill a void within Himself, but to share His glory, to reveal His truth, and to invite others into the wonder of His being. The existence of the universe does not change who He is. Rather, it is a reflection of what He always was. But here lies the paradox. While God's solitude is perfect, He still desires to be known. He is not distant out of indifference, nor silent out of coldness, but rather because He calls us to seek Him. He is not a being to be grasped in haste, but to be discovered in reverence. His apparent distance is not a rejection, but an invitation to leave behind shallow distractions and step into the depths of true understanding. When we consider why God chooses to be alone, we must recognize that His solitude is not like ours. It is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be embraced. It is a mystery not meant to push us away, but to draw us closer. For in His divine aloneness, we find not absence, but the very source of all that is. Sharmanimut. God is complete in Himself. He is not a being who requires sustenance, companionship, or affirmation. Unlike creation, which is bound by needs and dependencies, God exists in perfect self-sufficiency. This truth sets him apart from all things, distinguishing him as the uncaused cause, the eternal foundation upon which all else rests. While human existence is marked by a constant striving for fulfillment, God lacks nothing. His solitude is not a sign of limitation, but of infinite wholeness. To understand this, we must first recognize the nature of dependency. Everything in the universe relies on something else. The stars burn only because of the fuel that sustains them. The oceans are filled only because rivers flow into them. Life itself is a fragile web of interconnected needs, each link dependent on another. But God is not a part of this chain. He does not derive his existence from another source, nor does he rely on anything outside of himself to continue being. He simply is. This idea is difficult for the human mind to grasp, because we are creatures defined by limitations. We wake each morning with needs: food to sustain the body, relationships to nourish the heart, knowledge to enrich the mind. Even the strongest and most independent among us must acknowledge that they are not self-sufficient. But God is different. He is not strong because he has acquired strength. He is strength itself. He does not love because he has learned to love. He is love itself. Every attribute he possesses is not something he has gained, but something he has always been, without change, without growth, without deficiency. Because he is fully sufficient in himself, God does not need creation to complete him. This challenges a common human misunderstanding, that God created the world because he was lonely, that he made humanity because he longed for company. But this is not so. If God had required something outside of himself to be fulfilled, then he would not have been perfect to begin with. Creation is not an answer to a divine need. Rather, it is an overflow of divine abundance. The universe exists not because God was lacking, but because he desired to give. His self-sufficiency does not make him distant, but rather proves that his love is entirely selfless. Because God is self-sufficient, he is unchanging. He does not shift with time, does not evolve with history, and does not grow weary or uncertain. This is why he is the one true foundation upon which all things can rest. Human lives are shaped by circumstances, emotions, and external forces, but God remains steady, unmoved by the fluctuations of the created world. He is the rock upon which all trust can be placed, for he does not waver. His self-sufficiency is not a barrier to us, but an assurance. We do not worship a God who is needy or incomplete, but one who is eternally whole, eternally steadfast, and eternally sufficient in himself. God's solitude is not a wall that separates him from creation, but a door that invites us to seek him. Many assume that because he is self-sufficient and complete, he remains distant, detached, and uninterested in human affairs. Yet the opposite is true. His very nature, though fully independent, is one of invitation. He does not need us, but he desires that we know him. This is not a desire born of deficiency, but of generosity. His solitude is not a rejection of relationship. Rather, it is an opportunity for us to approach him freely, not out of obligation, but out of love. If God had made himself fully seen and understood from the beginning, humanity would not seek him out of love, but out of necessity. There would be no faith, no longing, no journey toward deeper understanding. We would acknowledge him as we acknowledge the rising of the sun, an undeniable reality, but not a personal pursuit. Yet, God desires something greater than mere recognition. He desires a relationship. Relationships are not built on force or compulsion, but on willing pursuit. Thus he remains unseen, not to be absent, but to be sought after. How love functions in human relationships. Forced love is not love at all, and a relationship that lacks choice is empty. If someone were compelled to love another with no freedom to turn away, the relationship would be meaningless. Love gains its depth from the ability to choose, to seek, to long for the beloved. God, in his wisdom, allows humanity to approach him on these terms. He does not impose himself upon us, but allows us to recognize our need for him. His solitude, then, is not a sign of distance, but an open space where we are free to respond to his call. Some might ask, if God wants us to know him, why does he not make himself more obvious? But would that truly draw people closer, or would it merely demand compliance? The greatest treasures are those sought after, and the most meaningful relationships are those built through effort and desire. God, in remaining unseen, invites us into a journey, one of discovery, of questioning, of reaching beyond ourselves, questioning of some greater range of senses. In this seeking, we come to know him more deeply than if he had simply overwhelmed us with his presence. This invitation is not given to a select few, but to all. There is no barrier except the one we place in our own hearts. He calls through the stillness, through the longing in the human soul, through the beauty of creation, and through the quiet whisper of truth. Those who seek will find, not because God is hiding, but because he desires that we approach willingly. His solitude is not the absence of love, but its highest form. He does not force, does not demand, but simply invites. And in that invitation he offers the greatest gift. Not merely knowledge of his existence, but a relationship built on love, freely chosen. Human beings long for companionship. From the moment we enter the world, we are drawn to others, to the warmth of a mother's embrace, to the security of friendship, to the deep connection of love. We define our existence in relation to others, finding meaning, comfort, and purpose in relationships. This longing is not merely a cultural construct, but a fundamental part of who we are. We seek others because we are incomplete on our own. Our solitude is often a burden, a reminder of our limitations. God, however, is different. His solitude is not a sign of deficiency, but of completeness. He does not seek relationship to fill a void within himself, for he lacks nothing. While we reach for others because we are incomplete, God exists in perfect wholeness. He is not shaped by longing or need. He does not create out of loneliness or seek worship to affirm his worth. His being is entirely self-sufficient, standing beyond the grasp of dependency. Despite this vast difference, there is something remarkable. God, in his perfect solitude, invites us into relationship, not because he requires us, but because he chooses to love. This distinction is crucial. Human love often arises from necessity. We seek others because we cannot bear to be alone, but divine love is pure gift. It is not a transaction, not an exchange where God gains something in return. His love is an overflowing abundance, given freely without condition or need. This contrast between human longing and divine fulfillment can be difficult to grasp. We often project our own experiences onto God, assuming that he must desire companionship as we do. But his desire for relationship is not rooted in emptiness. If he needed us to be whole, then he would not be God. A being that requires something outside of itself is not truly self-sufficient. God does not love us because he is incomplete. He loves us because love is his very nature. This truth is both humbling and liberating. It humbles us because it reminds us that we are not necessary to God's existence. He was, is, and will always be complete, whether or not we choose to seek him. But it also liberates us because it means that his love is not conditional. It is not something we must earn or maintain through effort. He does not love us out of need, but out of pure generosity. We do not complete him. He completes us. While human longing arises from lack, God's love arises from fullness. He does not need us, yet he desires to know us. He does not depend on us, yet he invites us to depend on him. In this we find the great paradox of divine love. The one who requires nothing offers everything. And in recognizing this, we come to understand that our own longing for fulfillment can only be truly satisfied in him. There are moments in life when God seems silent. We pray, we seek, we cry out, yet no answer comes. The silence can feel like absence, like rejection, like an unbearable distance between the Creator and his creation. Many have wrestled with this experience, wondering why a loving God would withhold his voice. If he desires relationship, why does he not always seek? If he calls us to seek him, why does he sometimes seem so hidden? To understand this, we must first recognize that God's silence is not the same as human neglect. When people are silent toward one another, it is often a sign of indifference, anger, or estrangement. But God's silence is not rooted in apathy. It is intentional, purposeful, and full of meaning. Just as a teacher remains quiet during a test so that the student can apply what they have learned, God sometimes withdraws his immediate presence so that we might grow. His silence is not abandonment, it is an invitation. Silence has always played a role in spiritual growth. Throughout history, those closest to God have encountered periods of divine quiet. Abraham, called to be the father of nations, faced years of silence between God's promises and their fulfillment. Job, in his suffering, longed for an answer from God and found only silence before the final revelation. Even Jesus, in his most agonizing moment on the cross, cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Yet in each of these cases, silence was not the end of the story. It was a path to deeper faith, a journey toward greater understanding. If God spoke clearly at all times, faith would not be necessary. We would not learn to trust, to wait, to seek him with sincerity. Love that is constantly reassured without challenge does not mature. It is in the silence that we learn to pursue God for who he is, not merely for what he gives. A child may cling to a parent's hand in comfort, but there comes a time when the child must walk forward in trust, even when the hand is no longer felt. Silence teaches us to listen more deeply. Often we expect God to speak in grand, unmistakable ways. Thunder from the heavens, miraculous signs, undeniable answers. But more often he speaks in the stillness. When the noise of life is stripped away, when we quiet our restless hearts, we find that he has been speaking all along, not in loud proclamations, but in the gentle whisper of truth. God's silence is not a barrier but a doorway. It is not an absence but a different form of presence. It compels us to seek him beyond emotions, beyond immediate gratification, and into a faith that is steadfast. And when the silence lifts, when his voice is heard again, we realize that he was never truly gone. He was simply drawing us deeper, teaching us to trust, and preparing us to listen. Solitude is often misunderstood. In a world filled with constant noise, endless distractions, and the pressure to always be connected, being alone is frequently seen as something to be avoided. Many fear silence, associating it with isolation, insignificance, or even failure. Yet, throughout history, some of the greatest moments of insight, creativity, and spiritual awakening have come not in the company of others, but in the quiet of solitude. This is no accident. The human soul, when removed from the clamor of the world, is more attuned to the deeper realities of existence, and in these moments of stillness, we begin to reflect the divine. God, in his infinite completeness, dwells in perfect solitude. Unlike human solitude, which can often feel like emptiness, his is one of absolute fullness. He does not require the company of others to be whole, nor does he seek validation through relationships. He is self-sufficient, lacking nothing. Yet, remarkably, he has created beings in his image, and part of that image includes the capacity for solitude, not as a punishment, but as a gift. When we embrace solitude, we step into a space that allows us to know both ourselves and God more fully. Many fear being alone because it forces them to confront their own thoughts, weaknesses, and uncertainties. But it is precisely in this confrontation that growth occurs. Without distraction, we see ourselves more clearly. Without external noise, we hear the quiet voice of truth. In solitude, we recognize our dependence on God, rather than the fleeting securities of the world. This is why so many great thinkers, leaders, and spiritual seekers throughout history have sought solitude as a means of deepening their understanding. The prophets withdrew to the wilderness, saints spent years in reflection, and even Jesus himself retreated into the mountains to pray. These moments of isolation were not acts of despair, but deliberate choices to connect with something beyond the temporary demands of life. Solitude is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is the pain of being disconnected from others, while solitude is the intentional embrace of being alone for a purpose. One is a wound, the other is a path to wisdom. The world often equates success with constant movement, believing that time spent in quiet is time wasted. But in truth, the greatest clarity often comes in moments of stillness. Just as the surface of a lake becomes a perfect mirror when the waters are calm, so too does the human soul reflect divine truth when it is at peace. In embracing solitude, we do not turn away from life, but prepare ourselves to live more fully. We align ourselves with the nature of God, who exists in perfect wholeness, yet invites us into his presence. It is in these quiet moments that we come to understand that solitude is not emptiness, but a space filled with divine possibility, and in seeking it, we draw closer to the One who has been waiting for us all along. In the restless pursuit of meaning, people often look for God in the extraordinary. They expect to find him in grand miracles, powerful signs, or overwhelming experiences. They search for him in the noise of the world, in dramatic revelations, and in the validation of human approval. Yet time and time again, God chooses to reveal himself not in the chaos, but in the stillness. He is found not in the thunder, but in the whisper, not in the earthquake, but in the quiet breath of existence. To truly seek God, we must learn to embrace silence, for it is in the stillness that he speaks. This is a truth woven into the fabric of history. When Moses encountered God, it was not in the splendor of Egypt's palaces, but in the stillness of the burning bush. When Elijah sought the Lord, he did not find him in the wind, the fire, or the earthquake, but in the gentle whisper that followed. Even Jesus, in moments of greatest significance, withdrew from the crowds to pray alone, demonstrating that communion with God is often most profound in solitude. Modern life resists stillness. The world is filled with distractions, constant entertainment, endless communication, and the pressure to always be engaged. People fear quiet because it forces them to confront their own thoughts, their own doubts, and the deeper questions they would rather ignore. But it is in this very silence that the presence of God becomes clearest. Seeking God in stillness requires discipline. It is not a passive waiting, but an active pursuit. It means setting aside distractions, quieting the mind, and creating space for His voice to be heard. Just as a musician must listen carefully to detect the subtlest notes in a melody, so too must we listen intently to perceive the gentle call of the divine. The noise of the world does not drown out God's voice. Rather, it is our own unwillingness to be still that keeps us from hearing it.